The world, for Eliza Bethorn, was a patch of unforgiving land wrung dry by a son just as unforgiving as her father. Her existence was a rotation of thankless duties, hauling water from the creek until her shoulders screamed, mending clothes by the dim flicker of a tallow lamp until her eyes burned, and tending a garden that seemed to begrudge every vegetable it surrendered. She was the engine of the homestead, tireless and unseen, running on a fuel of quiet resignation. Her father, Silas Bethorn, was a man carved from granite and judgment. His rare smiles were reserved for Clara, Eliza's younger sister. Clara was a vision of sun, kissed hair and cornflower, blue eyes, a girl who seemed to have absorbed all the beauty and light that had been denied to Eliza. Eliza, with her quiet gray eyes, mousy brown hair, and a face she had long ago accepted as plain, was a constant, dull disappointment to him. "Straighten your back, Eliza," Silas would bark, even when she was bent over the washtub. "A door-face sours the milk." Clara would simply laugh, a sound like tiny bells, a sound that only ever made Eliza feel more invisible. The injustice was the very air she breathed. When a new dress was fashioned, it was for Clara. When a tender piece of venison was served, it was for Clara. When a moment of fatherly affection was dispensed, it was for Clara. Eliza's inheritance was the mended, the leftover, and the overlooked. She didn't resent her sister, not truly. She resented the world that had decided, without her consent, that one of them was a wildflower and the other a weed. One sweltering afternoon, they arrived. Dust rose on the horizon first, a hazy plume that slowly resolved into 3 riders. They were Apache, their presence sending a ripple of fear through the scattered homesteads in the valley. They rode with a fluid confidence that seemed to part the air before them. Their leader, a man who sat straighter and taller than the others, dismounted before their cabin. He was broad-shouldered, with a face of sharp angles and intelligent eyes that missed nothing. He moved not with aggression, but with an unnerving authority. Silas met him outside, his hand near the axe propped against the cabin wall. "State your business," he said, his voice tight. The Apache leader spoke in clipped but clear English. "I am Talion. We need horses. Good ones. For a long journey." Silas's eyes narrowed. Horses were his pride, his most valuable asset. He gestured to the corral, where 3 of his best stood swishing their tails in the heat. A tense negotiation began, a bartering of blankets, knives, and beads. Talion was unmoved. He wanted the horses, but Silas's price was too high, and Talion's trade goods were, to Silas, insufficient. The stalemate hung in the hot, still air. Eliza watched from the doorway, a silent shadow. Clara peeked from behind the curtain, her expression one of fearful excitement. Talion's gaze drifted past Silas for a moment and landed on the 2 sisters. He saw Clara's obvious, blooming beauty, and then his eyes settled on Eliza. They held her gaze for only a second, but in that moment, she felt seen in a way that was more unsettling than being ignored. An idea, ugly and sharp, bloomed in Silas's mind. He looked at Talion, then at his own daughters, and back again. He saw a problem and a solution converging. "You want the horses?" Silas said, his voice changing, taking on the sly tone he used when he felt a profitable trade. "The price is not goods." He paused, letting the weight of his next words settle. "The price is a wife." Talion's face remained a mask of stone. "We have our own women, not a daughter of a white man." Silas pressed, cruel smirk twisting his lips. He gestured dismissively toward the doorway where Eliza stood frozen. "Take her. She is strong, a good worker, and I will have 3 less horses to feed." He had meant to offer Clara, to show off his prime asset, but the words had twisted. Why give away his jewel when he could finally be rid of his burden? The world tilted on its axis for Eliza. The heat, the buzz of flies, the scent of dry earth, it all receded into a dull roar in her ears. He was selling her. Not just selling her, but advertising her as a beast of burden, her only virtues being strength for labor. She felt a hot spike of shame, so intense it almost brought her to her knees. Her own father. Talion's gaze moved back to Eliza. He looked at her not with lust or even interest, but with an unreadable, analytical intensity. He saw the worn dress, the calloused hands, the way she stood as if waiting for a blow. But he also saw the straightness of her spine under the worn fabric, and the tremor in her jaw that was not from fear, but from a rage she could not express. He saw a flicker of a caged fire. He gave a short, sharp nod. The horses for the girl. The deal was done. Clara gasped, a hand flying to her mouth, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and a sliver of pity that felt more insulting than her usual indifference. Eliza's heart, which had been hammering against her ribs, suddenly felt like a cold, dead stone in her chest. Silas turned to her, his face devoid of all emotion save for a grim satisfaction. "Pack your things," he ordered, as if he were telling her to fetch the water. "You have been traded." There was nothing to pack. The threadbare dress on her back, the worn leather shoes on her feet. That was the sum of her worldly possessions. She owned nothing, not even herself. Talion and his men waited by the corral, their new horses already in hand. Silas didn't even watch her go. He was busy admiring the space in his stable, the calculation of his profit already tallied in his mind. The last thing Eliza saw of her home was Clara's face in the window, a pale, haunted moon that disappeared as they rode away. The journey was a blur of terror. Eliza was placed on a horse, and though she could ride, every muscle in her body was clenched tight. She was surrounded by men whose language was a collection of guttural sounds, and whose faces were impassive, alien masks. Talion rode at the front, his back a rigid wall of muscle and leather. He never looked back, never spoke a word to her. She was cargo, a piece of the transaction, and she was being transported to her destination. Fear was a living thing inside her, clawing at her throat. Every story she'd ever heard about the Apache. Tales of brutality and savagery told by men like her father swirled in her mind. She thought of the pain, the humiliation, the unknown horrors that awaited her. More than once, the thought of throwing herself from the horse and running into the wilderness crossed her mind. But where would she go? She was a ghost in her own land, belonging nowhere. To die in the wild seemed only a slightly worse fate than the one she was riding toward. They traveled for 2 days, stopping only for brief rests where she was given water and a piece of dry meat, offered without ceremony or kindness. On the evening of the 2nd day, they arrived. The Apache camp, the rancheria, was nestled in a hidden canyon, a collection of wickiups, domed huts made of brush and hide, that blended almost seamlessly into the landscape. Smoke from cooking fires drifted lazily into the twilight sky, carrying scents of roasting meat, wood smoke, and something else, something wild and unfamiliar. Her arrival caused an immediate stir. Women stopped their work, their dark eyes following her with open suspicion. Children, who had been playing, fell silent and stared. She was an outsider, a ghost of a different color, a symbol of the encroaching world that threatened them. Talion dismounted and spoke to his men, his voice low and firm. They dispersed, leaving her standing alone by the horse, the object of every curious and hostile gaze. Talion approached her and gestured toward a small wickiup on the edge of the settlement. It was smaller than the others, clearly unoccupied. "This is yours," he said, the first direct words he'd spoken to her since the trade. His English was functional, but held no warmth. She slid stiffly from the horse, her legs trembling. She stood before the small hut, a prison cell with walls of grass and hide. This was it. This was her new life. The crushing weight of her reality settled upon her, so heavy it was hard to breathe. The hostility from the other women was a palpable force, a wall of resentment she had no idea how to breach. They muttered to each other in their own tongue, and though she couldn't understand the words, the meaning was clear in their scornful glances. She was the white woman, the unwanted, the price paid for horses. That night, she huddled inside the wickiup on a pile of dry grass, listening to the alien sounds of the camp. Laughter, conversations, the cry of a baby, the soft rhythm of a distant drum. It was the sound of a community, a family. And she was utterly, completely outside of it. Tears she had refused to shed in front of her father or her captors now fell freely, soaking into the dry earth floor of her new cage. She wept for the life she had lost, as miserable as it had been, and for the terrifying emptiness of the one that had just begun. The days that followed were a trial by fire and silence. Eliza's life became a new kind of servitude, one governed by unspoken rules she didn't understand. The Apache women ignored her, turning their backs when she approached, offering no guidance. She was left to fend for herself, a ghost drifting at the edges of the community. Her hunger became a gnawing ache, as no one offered her food. She learned to forage for berries and roots she vaguely recognized from her own hard-scrabble life, her stomach often cramping from her meager diet. She was an outcast, and her solitude was a heavy cloak. Yet, within that isolation, a stubborn spark of defiance began to glow. She would not starve. She would not break. She would survive this, if only to spite the man who had thrown her away. The first crack in the wall of ice came from Talion. He never spoke to her, but his actions began to form a silent language. One morning, after a particularly cold night, she found a thick buffalo hide folded neatly outside her wickiup. It hadn't been there before. Another day, as she struggled to haul a skin of water from the creek, he walked past, and a few moments later she found a small, freshly killed rabbit lying on the path ahead of her. It was left without a word, without a look, but it was a clear offering. Sustenance. Then there were the smaller moments, when a group of young men jeered at her in their own language. Talion's voice cut through the air from across the camp, a single sharp word that silenced them instantly. They scattered, refusing to meet her eyes. He was watching, she realized, not with warmth, but with a sense of responsibility. She was his, and what was his, he protected. The true turning point came in the form of an old woman named Eliza. Her face was a beautiful map of wrinkles, her eyes holding a deep, ancient wisdom. Eliza had been watching Eliza, observing her quiet persistence, her refusal to beg or weep in public. One afternoon, as Eliza struggled to grind corn with a rough stone, making a clumsy mess, Eliza approached. The old woman said nothing. She simply knelt, took the stone from Eliza's hands, and with slow, deliberate movements, demonstrated the correct rhythm, the right pressure. Eliza watched, mesmerized. When Azusa was done, she handed the stone back. Eliza mimicked the movements, her actions still awkward but better. A flicker of something, not quite a smile, but a deep-seated approval, showed in Azusa's eyes. From then on, Azusa became her silent teacher. She taught Eliza how to properly cure a hide, which plants were for medicine and which for dye, how to weave a watertight basket. The lessons were all in pantomime, a language of hands and gestures. And as Eliza learned, the other women's hostility began to soften, replaced by a grudging respect. She was not a lazy or useless white woman. She worked hard, she learned, and she did not complain. One evening, as Talion sat by the fire, cleaning his rifle, Eliza found the courage to approach him. She carried a small bowl with a poultice of herbs Azusa had shown her, good for soothing aches. She had noticed him favoring his shoulder, the result of a hard ride. She stood before him, her heart thudding. He looked up, his expression unreadable. Wordlessly, she held out the bowl. He stared at it, then at her. For a long moment, she thought he would refuse it, or worse, laugh at her. But then he gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. He took the bowl, his fingers brushing hers for the briefest of moments. The touch was like a spark on dry tinder. She retreated to her wickiup, her cheeks burning. It was a small thing, a simple gesture of care, but it was the first time she had offered something that was accepted, the first time she had been more than just a purchase. What Eliza didn't realize was that Talion hadn't chosen her for her meekness, but for the flicker of defiance he saw in her eyes the moment her father announced her fate. He had seen women who were beautiful but weak, women who were compliant but held no spirit. In her, he had gambled on something else entirely, a soul that had been buried but not broken. And now, watching her from across the fire, he saw the first green shoots of that soul breaking through the barren ground. The seasons turned, and with them, the seasons of Eliza's soul. The harsh sun of summer softened into the golden light of autumn, and the timid outcast began to find her footing. The Apache language, once a meaningless collection of sounds, started to form into words and phrases. Azusa's lessons became conversations, her gnarled hands now accompanied by a soft, spoken narrative of her people's history and ways. Eliza learned that her quiet diligence, a trait her father had exploited and despised, was a virtue here. Her patient mending of clothes, her meticulous tending of a small herb garden she started near her wickiup, her gentle way with an injured dog, these things were noticed. The women of the tribe began to include her in their work, not out of pity, but out of a shared sense of purpose. She learned to laugh with them, a sound she hadn't realized her own throat could make. Her transformation was most evident in her relationship with Talion. The space between their wickiups, once a vast chasm of fear and uncertainty, slowly shrank. He began to eat his evening meal near her fire, the two of them sitting in a comfortable silence that was more intimate than any conversation she had ever had with her father. One evening, she was struggling to stitch a tough piece of hide. Her hands, though calloused, ached with the effort. Talion, watching her, wordlessly took the piece from her. He pulled a sharp awl from his belt, and with a few deft movements pierced the holes she needed. He handed it back to her, their fingers brushing again. This time, the touch lingered for a second longer. "Your hands hold skill," he said, his voice a low rumble. The simple praise landed in her heart like a seed. Eliza is a good teacher, she managed, her voice barely a whisper. Eliza teaches the willing, he replied, his gaze steady. She does not waste her time. It was then that she began to uncover the truth of the man she had been sold to. She saw him not just as a warrior, but as a leader. She saw the way his people came to him with their disputes, how he listened patiently before delivering a judgment that was always fair. She saw him play with the children, a rare, genuine smile softening the hard lines of his face. She learned he carried his own sorrows, a wife and son lost to the white man's sickness years ago, a grief that had carved a space of honor and solemnity within him. He was not a savage, he was a man of profound depth and integrity. In seeing his true nature, she began to uncover her own. The label of ugly, seared into her identity by her father, began to peel away. Here, her worth was not measured by the fairness of her skin or the color of her eyes. It was measured by the strength of her spirit, the kindness in her hands, and the courage in her heart. Talion had never once looked at her with the dismissive pity she had known her whole life. He looked at her as if he were seeing the very essence of her, the part that had nothing to do with her face at all. One night, a wolf pack, made bold by hunger, crept too close to the camp. Their howls were chilling, a sound of primal danger. Eliza, startled from sleep, felt a wave of fear. The flap of her wickiup was pushed aside, and Talion stood there, a silhouette against the moonlight. He said nothing, but his presence was a question. She understood. She rose and followed him to his much larger wickiup at the center of the camp. He gestured for her to enter, then secured the flap behind them. It was not a command, but an offering of safety. Inside, a small fire cast flickering shadows on the walls. He laid out a sleeping robe for her on one side of the fire and took the other for himself. The space was filled with the scent of him. Leather, smoke, and wild sage. Lying there in the warm, protected dark, listening to the steady sound of his breathing, Eliza felt a sense of peace she had never known. She was not his captive, she was his charge. And in this place where her soul could finally breathe, she realized with a startling certainty that she was falling in love with the man her father had given her to because she was ugly. The peace of the canyon was a fragile thing, bubble of existence that the outside world constantly threatened to pop. That threat arrived not with the crack of a rifle, but with the braying of a mule. A pair of prospectors, Jed and Sam, chasing rumors of gold, had wandered far from the established trails and stumbled into the Apache's hidden territory. They were apprehended by Talion's scouts and brought to the camp, their faces pale with fear. Talion questioned them, his voice calm but edged with steel. He wanted to know who they were and what they were doing on his people's land. As they stammered their explanations, Jed's eyes scanned the camp and suddenly widened in disbelief. He saw Eliza, her hair now longer and braided in the Apache style, her skin tanned by the sun, her dress a soft deerskin tunic. She stood near Uzusa, her posture poised and confident. She was so transformed that he almost didn't recognize her. "I'll be damned," Jed muttered to Sam. "That's Silas Bithorn's girl, the plain one." Eliza's blood ran cold. The sound of her father's name was a stone dropped into the placid waters of her new life. She met Jed's gaze, her expression hardening into a mask of neutrality, but inside, her heart hammered. Talion, noticing the exchange, gave the prospectors a stern warning. They were to leave immediately and never return. They were to forget what they saw. Their lives depended on it. Terrified, Jed and Sam agreed, scrambling away from the camp as soon as they were released. But a secret like that was a valuable coin. Weeks later, back in the dusty settlement nearest the Bethorn homestead, Jed's tongue loosened with whiskey. The story came pouring out. A fantastic tale of being captured by Apaches and seeing Silas Bethorn's cast-off daughter living among them. And not as no slave neither. Jed slurred to a captive saloon audience. She was dressed like one of stood there proud as you please. Looked like she was the wife of their chief. A big, fearsome devil named Talion. The news spread like wildfire and inevitably reached the ears of Silas Bethorn. He listened, his mind churning. The daughter he had sold for a handful of horses, the worthless, ugly burden, was now the wife of an influential leader. His mind didn't process it as her good fortune. It processed it as his loss. He had been swindled. He had sold a low-value asset that had somehow become high value. The connection to an Apache chief could be useful. For land, for trade, for power. His daughter and her position belonged to him. Behind the scenes, Silas's greed began to curdle into a righteous fury. He began to reframe the narrative in his own mind. His daughter hadn't been traded. She had been stolen. He wasn't a callous father. He was a victim. He started talking to the men in town, men who were already hostile toward the Apache, stirring up their fear and prejudice. He spoke of a father's right, protecting white womanhood from savages. He was no longer just a cruel man. He was a man with a cause, and he was formulating a plan to go and rescue the daughter he had so willingly discarded and reclaim the asset he now coveted. Unaware of the storm gathering on the horizon, Eliza's life in the canyon continued to deepen. Her bond with Talion was no longer unspoken. It lived in shared glances across the fire, in the way he would bring her a wildflower from his patrols, in the way she would have a hot broth ready for him when he returned. She was happy. For the first time in her life, she felt she was home. But the echoes of her cruel past were growing louder, and they were about to come crashing into her peaceful present. The attack came on a bright, cold morning. It wasn't the full-scale assault Silas had likely envisioned, but an arrogant procession. He rode at the head of 5 other men, their faces a mixture of grim determination and nervous bluster. They stopped at the edge of the camp, a stark and unwelcome intrusion. The camp fell silent. Warriors materialized from the wickiups, bows in hand, their faces hard. Talion emerged from his lodge, Eliza a step behind him. Her blood turned to ice when she saw her father, his face puffed up with a self-righteous fury she knew all too well. "I've come for my daughter," Silas bellowed, his voice echoing unnaturally in the canyon. "I've come to take her back from you heathens." Talion stood impassive, a rock against which Silas's angry words crashed. "She is my wife," Talion stated, his voice low and dangerous. "She is not yours to take." "She is my blood! You stole her from me!" Silas lied, his voice dripping with false paternal rage. He looked directly at Eliza, his eyes filled with contempt. "Look at you. Dressed in filth, living like a savage. Have you no shame? Your sister weeps for you. I've come to bring you home." The lie about Clara weeping was so blatant, so absurd, it broke the spell of fear that had held Eliza captive. A lifetime of humiliation, being treated as less then of swallowing her pain, came to a boiling point. This man, who had sold her like livestock, now stood before her new family and called himself her savior. A fire she never knew she possessed roared to life in her chest. She took a step forward, moving from behind the protective wall of Talion's body. All eyes fell on her. Her father's face registered shock. He had expected the timid, broken girl he had cast away. He was not prepared for the woman who now faced him. "You have no daughter here," Eliza said. Her voice did not tremble. It was clear, steady, and sharp as flint. She spoke in English for him and his men to understand perfectly. "The daughter you had, you sold for 3 horses. Do you find the price was too low now?" "Father." Silas's face mottled with rage and surprise. "You will hold your tongue, girl!" "You are confused. They have twisted your mind." "My mind has never been clearer." Eliza shot back, taking another step. "You speak of shame. I knew shame every day in your house. It was the food you fed me, the air you made me breathe. Here." She swept her arm out to encompass the camp, the wickiups, the faces of the people watching. "I know what it is to have a family. I know what it is to be respected." She turned her head slightly, her gaze finding Talion's. In his eyes, she saw not surprise, but a deep, blazing pride. That look gave her the final piece of strength she needed. She turned back to Silas, and her voice rose, ringing with the force of her conviction. Then, she did something that sealed her fate and shattered his power forever. She switched to the Apache tongue, her accent still imperfect, but her words flowing with passion, speaking now to her true people. "She is the Nisho," she declared. "I am his wife! D.A.K. Tudong Shingen! This is my home! This man is nothing. He threw me away. You are my people now." The warriors of the tribe, who had stood ready for battle, lowered their bows slightly, their expressions shifting from hostility toward the outsiders to awe at the woman in their midst. They had accepted her as Talion's wife, but in this moment, she had forged her own name in the fire of confrontation. She was not just the white woman Talion had taken. She was one of them, fighting for them, for her home, with the only weapon she had, her voice. Silas stood dumbfounded. He did not understand the words, but he understood the tone. He understood the unified wall of people now standing with his daughter against him. He had come to reclaim his property and found that it had a voice, a heart, and a warrior's spirit. He had lost. Talion stepped forward, his hand resting on Eliza's shoulder. He looked at Silas, his eyes cold as death. "You have your answer," he said in English. "Leave this place, and if you or any of your men ever return, you will not leave again." The threat was absolute. Silas, his face a mask of thwarted rage, sputtered for a moment, then yanked his horse's reins, turning it around. He and his men retreated in a cloud of dust and humiliation, their arrogant charge reduced to a shameful flight. Eliza stood, breathing heavily, the adrenaline slowly receding. She had faced her demon and had not flinched. She felt Talion's hand on her shoulder, a solid, grounding weight. She was no longer Eliza Bethorn, the castaway daughter. She was Eliza, wife of Talion, the one who spoke with fire. And she was finally truly home. The departure of Silas and his men left a profound silence in its wake, but it was not an empty silence. It was filled with a new, unspoken understanding. As Eliza turned to face the people of the camp, she saw that the last vestiges of doubt in their eyes had vanished. They looked at her with a raw, unvarnished respect. Eliza approached and placed a hand on Eliza's arm, her wrinkled face breaking into a rare, wide smile. The other women followed, touching her shoulder, murmuring words of approval in their own language. Her brave stand had been a testament, and they had all borne witness. Later that evening, the air was crisp and scented with pine smoke. Eliza sat with Talion by their fire, the heart of their shared world. He had been quiet since the confrontation, but it was a thoughtful, deep silence. He finally turned to her, his gaze so intense it felt as though he were seeing into her very soul. "That name, Bethorn," he said, the word sounding foreign and ugly in his mouth. "It is the name of a man who trades his blood for horses. It is a name of shame." Eliza nodded, pang of the old hurt surfacing before dissolving in the warmth of the fire. "It is the only name I have ever known. A person is not born with a name," Talion said, his voice a low, resonant rumble. "They earn it. Today, you earned your name." He reached out, his calloused fingers gently touching her cheek. "You are not the daughter of that man. You are Cain, the Fire Heart. It is who you are, Cain, the Fire Heart." Tears welled in Eliza's eyes, but these were not tears of sorrow or shame. They were tears of profound joy, of being seen and known for the very spirit her father had tried so hard to extinguish. This was a beauty that had nothing to do with her face and everything to do with her soul. He leaned in and kissed her, a kiss that was not about possession or passion, but about recognition. It was a sealing of their bond, a silent vow that transcended language and culture. In his arms, she was not property, not a trade, not a burden. She was his partner, his equal, his Fire Heart. Her father's cruelest act, meant to declare her worthless, had ironically been the catalyst for her to discover her true value. He had given her to an Apache because he thought she was ugly, but in doing so, he had delivered her to the only man who could ever see her true beauty, and who loved her like no other man ever could. And so, Eliza's journey from being an unwanted daughter in a cold cabin to becoming the respected Cain in a loving community serves as a powerful reminder that our worth is not determined by the cruel judgments of others, but by the fire we carry within our own hearts. True belonging is found not in the place we are born, but in the place where our soul is finally seen. If this story of resilience and the fight for justice stirred something in you, please share your thoughts in the comments below. Give this video a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring narratives about people who turned adversity into triumph. What was the most impactful moment for you?